broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the fundamentals of fundraising. We've got a good turnout today. My name is Mike Farwell. I'm head of the Charities and Education team at James Cooper Preston. We work with around 200 charities, and I'm joined by Colin Weatherup of Greenhill Consulting Services, who are a specialist fundraising consultancy for charities. Colin's done lots of work with charities, including a number of our clients, and has been instrumental in those charities raising very significant sums. So Colin will be doing most of the talking. I'm sure he'll be delighted to hear, and he's got some really interesting stuff in his presentation. You should all have the slides in front of you. You should also have the facility, if you have any questions, to input them, and we will deal with those at the end. So with that introduction, we'll kick on. In terms of the things that we'll be looking at covering, I will be covering the importance of fundraising and reporting on fundraising. Colin will be covering various different types of fundraising tips and some of his recent experiences. So if we start with the importance of fundraising, the question, of course, of what is fundraising? I looked on the Institute of Fundraising website, and it says the way charities ask for donations or other financial support. So this could be a whole variety of sources, the public, businesses, government, foundations, etc. More from Colin on that later. And of course, fundraising is really important in the sense that it does provide the basis for a thriving voluntary sector. I suppose it's fair to say there are three sectors in the UK: the private sector, the public sector, and the third sector, which is become increasingly important in recent years. It's a big part, I think, fundraising of UK culture, although there have been some high-profile problems in recent years. Latest figures, just in terms of funds raised from the public, the latest estimate I've seen is around £9 billion a year, so pretty huge numbers. Who's involved in this? Well, a whole range of people: fundraisers, volunteers, employees, third parties, etc. Again, more of that later. And it's important in the sense that it does connect people with the cause. In terms of some of the key things, it's important in terms of developing positive, sustainable and respectful relationships. I mean, it's great if you are successful in some fundraising, but it's even better if you know that whatever the source of that funding is, that's likely to sustain you, not just on a one-off basis, but into the future. And as part of that, it's naturally relevant that you do have respectful relationships with whoever that is. Important that the values of the organisation are embedded into the strategy in your fundraising approach. We won't be covering compliance with regulation, but many of you will be aware, I'm sure, of the fundraising regulator and GDPR conditions, etc. The Code of Fundraising Practice has come in recent times. There are also various tax incentives for fundraising. The most obvious is gift aid. Again, we won't be covering that in any detail. And before I hand over to Colin, I think it's relevant to say that your reputation is a really big thing in the charity sector at the moment. Public's confidence in the sector has dropped in recent times after notably some issues at Oxfam and Save the Children, and as well as the reputation of the sector as a whole and the public confidence, it's important that you maintain your strong reputation as an individual charity. There has been some interesting stuff in the press in recent days around the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, RNLI, which historically has been extremely successful with its fundraising. It recently embarked on some ventures overseas in terms of stopping or implementing education to reduce drowning overseas. As a result of carrying out these activities overseas, the charity was criticised by a couple of Conservative MPs. And as a result of that, there was a huge surge in donations made to the RNLI. So quite difficult to anticipate that sort of activity, but it just goes to show what can be achieved. Before I hand over to Colin, we're just going to run a quick poll to gauge the breakdown of our audience. So a question should appear on your screen. So this is a question: are you a charity fundraiser? Are you a charity CEO/manager? Are you a trustee? Or are you some other category? It'd be quite helpful for us if you're able to fill that poll in so we can gauge some background from the audience. So I'll give you a few more seconds to do that. So just another second. Okay, so we've got, in terms of audience, pretty low number of charity fundraisers. Many of you are charity CEOs and managers, and the mysterious, around about 50% are other categories. So clearly our question was perhaps not as targeted as it might have been. So there's a bit of a wide mix on there, but perhaps not a huge number of specialist charity fundraisers. So that gives Colin a bit of an idea of what the audience is. I'll now hand over to Colin. He'll introduce himself and his credentials. Colin.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for inviting me in and for the introduction. Please feel free to post questions as we go through this, but as Mike has already touched on, we'll be looking really at the importance of fundraising to charities in the current environment, and also thinking about the different types of fundraising, and I will try my best to pass on any insights that I've picked up in recent years and during my career over the last 14 years. So just a quick introduction from me. I previously worked in the private sector in banking and property up until the mid-2000s, but I've been focused on charity fundraising for the last 14 years with a number of fairly significant projects, mostly based in London until more recently. And the reason Mike and I met was through the Rosemary Appeal, which for anyone who isn't familiar with it, we raised £5.5 million to build and renovate a renal dialysis and cancer care unit at the West Berkshire Community Hospital, which is just across the road from the office here in Newbury. Previously, I worked in London, as I say, on a number of projects in the health sector, education sector, and community and housing, in some fairly cutting-edge projects at the time, including the living wage, the introduction of community land trusts, and other projects around, mostly based around the community. But I'd be happy to share more about that if you'd like to follow up on any of those. But for the moment, in terms of this presentation, we will be focusing on the importance of fundraising, just to follow on from Mike's points, really from the charity perspective. And from my perspective as a professional fundraiser, the importance of fundraising has really been around charities better understanding business planning, implementation of business plans, and really building relationships, which I think for the charity sector is a relatively new concept. That hopefully now gone are the days of the image of the charity worker being someone who walks around the office in flip-flops, as it probably was at the beginning of my career. And I think everyone is aware that we need to be much more focused, much more performance-driven. So with that in mind, really, the points here in front of you are really about the importance of business planning. I'll go into some of these in more detail, but to summarise, we're talking about the fundraising function, assisting with the planning process to hopefully expose gaps in resources and capabilities for the charity, encouraging teamwork, and I'll say more about the importance of teamwork and understanding the dynamic of the staff and trustees and volunteers of the charity in order to achieve the goals that we're looking for, and obviously with that aligning the goals makes it easier for those teams to work together. It also facilitates the marketing and communication, which is a key part of any fundraising strategy. And then further down the line, allows the charity to assess its own impact and to evaluate on that, and also to be able to evaluate on whether or not they are meeting the needs of their beneficiaries, which ultimately is what every charity exists to do. So consistency, I mentioned here, is important, and I'll get onto that again. Impact measurement I've touched on, and a lot of this is really, in terms of business planning or fundraising strategy, is about having a proper understanding of how the organisation can sustain itself. So we will look at diversity of fundraising models, which again is critical for any charity, especially after the years of austerity that we've been through, where the charitable services are being pressed more than ever. So if we move on, again, I'm going to focus mostly on the Rosemary Appeal and the building of the wing of the hospital here in Thatcham and Newbury. And this illustrates where we went from and to. Actually, with this project, it was quite clear cut, and that makes it more straightforward, but also, is never free of challenges, which again I will touch on. But in terms of our objectives, we knew that we needed to build these units, and we were very specific about what the needs were, which made it fairly straightforward in the planning phase. So we needed a clear vision of what was to be achieved. This is us on site as it was before the build, and as the build was starting to come together. And it was very important at this stage that our vision, and really in terms of the fundraising strategy, was mostly about the amount of money that was required. But as you can imagine, for a project like this, the budgets never stay the same. But I will move on to that in a minute. I'm pleased to say that we got to the end, and you can see that illustrated here with some of the pictures of the key players involved with the fundraising committee, and with the opening by the Duchess of Gloucester at the top there, which happened only earlier this year. It was February this year. The project in total took 3 years. So as I mentioned about the planning, there are always issues that come up, and in this case, the original amount that we were hoping to raise was 4.5 million, and about halfway through the project, working with the project managers, we soon realised that was going to be more like 5.5 million. I'd like to say we were able to wave a magic wand and that everything just took care of itself, but there were a number of panics to start with. There were a number of uncertainties about how we were going to manage the situation. And to be fair, again, I'll get onto this a bit later, but the team really pulled together, and with a mixture of intensifying the communications to the local community, to building new relationships, to accelerating everything that we were doing. We did actually manage to reach that. It took us a little bit longer. It probably took us a year longer than we would have expected, but it was all done in the space of 3 years, which everyone was delighted about. Also worth just touching on the fact that it's not always quite as clear cut as saying we're going to build a hospital, and that there can be issues around campaigns that are probably less popular in the public eye. So building a hospital for cancer patients was almost an easy win. But again, I've worked on projects regarding refugees and to do with living wage, as I mentioned earlier, and that can be really tricky. But with a good case for support and a good understanding of who your target audience is, again, that sort of goes back to what I said earlier about the importance of a good business plan. So I mentioned as well about the importance of a good team. That is critical. And it's something that I would insist was in place. It's also important to acknowledge that there will be different skills on the core group. So the Rosemary Appeal, as an example, this is us getting an award from the Mayor of Thatcham, and also meeting the Lord Lieutenant of Berkshire. It was very helpful in introducing us to some key contacts, which eventually ended up leading to significant funds. But it's important that not only do you have the people who have those connections, that you have people who can stand up in a room of potential supporters and make the case very clearly, but also that you have people in the background who are willing to put the work in to make this happen, as well as coordinating approaches to the local community and to run events. Again, we'll get onto that later when we talk about the different types of funding, but it's very important to have people who have all those skills, and to focus on the people who stand up in front of the large audiences making the pitch would probably not lead to the successes that we we had with the Rosemary Appeal. Another key part of this, which I touched on in the original slide, and the importance, again, all of this comes back to good planning, implementing those plans, reviewing those plans, and building relationships. And the communication side of it is just as important in terms of obviously raising awareness, but being very focused on who you're speaking to, who's receiving these messages, how you're delivering those messages. One learning for us through the Rosemary Appeal was that we were quite focused on social media to begin with, and I think there's a part to be played for social media increasingly in everything that anyone is doing these days. But actually, what we found after 6 months or so was that the engagement on social media was not as beneficial to the campaign as things like having an article in the Newbury Weekly News, which is a local paper, and actually, as is probably reflected in the fact that we were raising money for people with cancer and people with renal issues. A large proportion of our audience was actually of a more mature demographic. So reaching them either through meetings or through the local papers or through means that they were more familiar with was really the way that we raised the amount of money that we did. The social media was very useful for informing people about events, but from the fundraising perspective directly, probably less so. Partnerships are another critical part of this, and that can relate to all relationships, but in terms of specific fundraising, I've mentioned here that it's important to collaborate with other charities and similar services. That wasn't necessarily relevant for the Rosemary Appeal. Obviously, we had quite a specific need that we were reaching, but the campaign came from a hospital. It came through. It was interesting because it was a collaboration to start with, because it came from the cancer charity locally, but it also came from the Hospital Building Trust, and they have been working together for 4 or 5 years to try and bring this to fruition. And it was only by working together that was possible. It's important to involve the local business community. I've got here, and we'll touch on that again when we go through the different types of fundraising. And again, from the fundraising perspective, many of the lessons that we learned through the Rosemary Appeal was around reaching out often on a one-to-one basis, or getting in touch with people directly. The vast majority of it's probably the Pareto 80-20 rule, where probably 80% of our funds came from 20% of our fundraising efforts. So those relationships were key, and actually I'll use we'll probably get onto this with the types of fundraising, but as with this the slide, the picture on the left, the Peter Baker Foundation, that was a key relationship where we submitted some funding applications to a foundation that had considerable means, but I think our first donation was for around £25,000. We nurtured that relationship. This had come through a local entrepreneur who had been building businesses since the 50s and 60s. As it turned out, in the middle of the campaign, Peter Baker, who founded the foundation, and was with the money in it was based on his income from his business enterprises. He unfortunately died during the campaign, but what that meant for the appeal was that they came back to us and told us that the Rosemary Appeal had been very important. So that £25,000 donation actually eventually, through many meetings and many interactions, resulted in an overall donation of £1 million. And the Peter Baker Foundation continues to be involved with the hospital, with the West Berkshire Community Hospital, and they are looking, along with Greenhill Trust, at putting a new CT scanner, which is going to be another £1 million project, which I think they'll be significant donors for. It's obviously very important to recognise the contributions of these, and again, it goes back to the relationships where it's absolutely critical that you understand the self-interest of those who are donating, and that you keep them informed at all times. And that was a very important part of, I think, the success of the Rosemary Appeal. Again, this could be a real, I think we did it quite well at Rosemary Appeal, but previously it sounds on paper as if it's very easy to get that right, but actually it can be really challenging, because where charities are really struggle with their own resources, that can saying thank yous and invitations to events can sometimes be lost, and I've certainly been guilty of that in the past, and potentially that has led to not having as fruitful a relationship as we could have. Peter Baker Foundation is a perfect example of that, where we were in touch with them closely. Their objectives were very much aligned with ours, and the end result was hopefully mutually beneficial for all. So we move on to the different types of fundraising. I've mentioned some of these already. I think the key in terms of what we mentioned already, and in terms of the fundraising strategy, is really around having a good breakdown of all of these. I wouldn't advocate one over any of the others, but the main focus is this is all fairly bread and butter stuff for any of you professional fundraisers or charitable managers out there, where you're looking at charitable foundations, high net worth individuals, local companies, corporates, legacy, public sector, digital fundraising, which obviously is becoming increasingly important and increasingly lucrative, and probably increasingly difficult to get right, because again, it's a marketing exercise in its own right. And again, with the Rosemary Appeal, community fundraising was a huge part of what we did. And again, having people on the fundraising committee who were less focused on major donors and engaging with the general public on a stage, for example, the people who went out, organised the fun runs, organised being at Sainsbury's, with the shaking the tins. In all, I think we raised not far off £1 million just from that alone. So it's important to have all of these.
Okay, so just to give us an indication of the key methods of fundraising for your charities, we're just launching another question here. Which type of fundraising is most important to your charity? So there are 5 options there: trusts and foundations, individuals and legacies, community fundraising, corporates and local businesses, and online. So if you could list your votes. Naturally, we appreciate that there are some crossovers between these, but it would be useful just to get a flavour. So I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, so we'll close the poll now. I mean, the vast majority of people were in trusts and foundations and individuals and legacies. Community fundraising is pretty low return in terms of our audience, and also corporates and local businesses is pretty low, which possibly indicates that these are quite difficult areas, or maybe that these are possible areas that you could look at doing in the future. So I'll hand back to Colin now, who's just going to touch on a couple of these areas. Colin.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'm aware that we're a bit short of time, so I'm probably going to rattle through these, but if anyone wants to follow up on any of this, please do get in touch. The charitable trusts and foundations, obviously there's a majority of people on the line who are involved in that. So again, this is fairly bread and butter in terms of researching, but it is really important that you carry out a really robust body of work in terms of understanding which foundations you're hoping to attract, and and how you might work together, and that the results will be mutually beneficial. So I think most of what's there is fairly self-explanatory: researching, establishing a database of sorts, exploring criteria on which the foundations make grants, which is, again, something that many charities, in my experience, can so easily get wrong, that you look out for these foundations with lots of money, and you try to squeeze your own objectives into what they might be looking for. So I think it's very, again, it comes back to what we talked about with communication and planning. You need to be very focused on what the charitable objectives are, very focused on what your short-term objectives are, and to ensure that you get those right. And then obviously submitting funding applications, which feeds back to the importance of a case for support, which I'll touch on again later. Again, relationships with corporates, in my experience, it's quite a tricky world to get into, but actually when it works, it really works. I have several experiences. I've got some logos up here: HSBC, KPMG, and Vodafone are probably the most significant of those. We had a should I tell that story, or do we need to move on? HSBC back in almost 20 years, oh no, it was 15 years ago. We were working on the living wage campaign, and a cleaner at HSBC stood up in the HSBC AGM and addressed Sir John Bond, who was the CEO at the time, and we had been trying to push for HSBC to pay the living wage, and he stood up. The cameras were all around, and we had briefed them that we were going to be there and we were going to possibly make a fuss. But he stood up and he said, "How can you afford to pay your top bankers and your top management £1 million in bonuses when you can't afford to pay your cleaners the living wage," which at the time was about £6 an hour? As you can probably imagine, very soon after that, they agreed to pay the living wage. They got some bad press out of that, but then they got some very good press when they eventually came through. KPMG equally started a relationship with one of the appeals that I was working on back in 2007, 2008, and they started just asking if they could place one of their interns there, which we agreed to, who's working on CSR. That very quickly turned into pro bono advice from them on all sorts of matters to do with our own office space, some of the legal issues we were having at the time, and all of this was free advice. It was invaluable, to the point that their head of CSR ended up seconding himself to us for 2 years and becoming chair of the Living Wage Foundation. That was living wage as well. Vodafone, actually I'm going to move on. So any lessons, I may have touched on these already. It is absolutely critical to build a strong and clear case for support. That is basically your business plan. It is something you can go back to time and again. It needs to be SMART, if you're familiar with the acronym. If not, get in touch and I'll be happy to talk you through it. But it's a really important basis for any appeal, along with the fundraising strategy, which addresses your marketing strategy and all your other objectives, and basically putting what needs to be turned into action on paper. I would add that these need to be reviewed constantly. Developing relationships and partnerships is key, which I've touched on. Raising public awareness, again through the marketing, I've touched on. Identifying new prospects, creating and developing a database of contacts. Probably more specifically, again, comes back to the sales and the marketing and the communication, but defining the elevator pitch, if you like, for your staff and your trustees is absolutely critical. Again, it feeds back to understanding exactly what the objectives of the charity are and making sure that all of your staff and trustees are on the same page. Staying well informed of the changes, and obviously investing in fundraising is a long-term strategy that can be difficult to convince trustees of or others in the short term, but actually does provide sustainability and resilience in the longer term. There's a slide here which has some resources relating to some of what I've said there. The legacy fundraising, the team building, I would advise doing. It's a sort of Myers-Briggs test on your teams to make sure that people are doing the right thing. But the wealth dynamics, which I tend to use more than the Myers-Briggs, is more sort of business oriented, which I think increasingly charities need to get online with. Institutional fundraising, directory for social change is a good resource in terms of understanding your own impact. Big Society Capital, if you go to their website and look up the impact matrix, it's important for understanding where your charity fits. And I tend to keep an eye on TED Talks quite a lot. A couple I watched recently was Melinda Gates on Coca-Cola, which again, both of these relate to the sort of business, charities becoming more business-like, I suppose. So Melinda Gates does a talk on Coca-Cola, and Dan Pallotta does a talk which is more general, but it's focused on how charities need to be more business-like, and how people who are donating need to think less about giving money and more about the sustainability that comes out of the work that the charities are doing.
Thanks very much, Colin. So I can certainly confirm, as someone who lives in Newry, the Rosemary Peel was extremely successful. The final section before we close is just on reporting on fundraising. So the charity sought the accounting rules have some requirements in terms of performance and effectiveness of fundraising, and the Charities Act 2016 introduced some new requirements which we'll go through in a minute. These are disclosures which will appear in the trustees report, and they're for large audited charities, so generally income over £1 million, although other charities are encouraged to disclose this information. I mean, as well as the disclosures, I think it's key to assess your fundraising costs against the income raised. So if you were spending £100,000 on fundraising costs and only generating £50,000 of income, questions need to be asked about how effective that is, and that information is available in the charities accounts. Charity Commission interested in this reporting. There have been public concerns about fundraising in recent years, so it's definitely something that they're interested in. In terms of the specific requirements which came in around about 2 years ago for additional disclosures in the trustees report, these last couple of slides just confirm that information. So information about whether you're using a professional fundraiser, if you're following a scheme or a standard, which one. So the most common one would be registration with the fundraising regulator and code of fundraising practice. Details about compliance with these schemes, how you monitor your fundraising activities, details about any complaints that you may have received, and information about potentially vulnerable people who might be affected from fundraising. So I think increasingly we're seeing now in charity accounts, depending on the type of charity that you are, perhaps 2 or 3 paragraphs around fundraising. But if fundraising really is a big thing for you, it may well be that the disclosure in your accounts is a bit more than that. So that sort of broadly brings to an end the formal presentation. We've had a couple of questions. What impact do you think Brexit might have on corporate fundraising? Colin, I don't know whether you have any thoughts on the dreaded Brexit question.
Yeah, well, that's a bit of a minefield, really. It's very difficult to ignore, but it's also very difficult to plan for, and I think this uncertainty is killing everything. But I think to be specific, the European Social Fund will obviously come to an end, assuming that we end up being out one way or the other. Anyone who's reliant on that or was thinking about applying for it is probably less likely. In theory, at least, the fund is open to the UK until at least the end of 2020. Whether or not any new bids would be going to UK charities is probably unlikely. The government has set up a fund called the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which is yet to launch, but it potentially could be there to replace the European Social Fund. I mean, for charities in general, I think you will know yourselves that they, especially for charities involved with service provision, have been stretched by the austerity measures that have been put in place by the government. Anyway, and in terms of how Brexit plays out and the impact that has, I think it's all going in that general direction. But it comes back to the fact that charities need to plan well, they need to have contingency plans in place, and they need to diversify their funding.
Okay, thanks, Colin. And the other question we've had in it is it worth registering with the fundraising regulator? So I'll take that one. I mean, registration with the fundraising regulator, I think generally is a voluntary, but it's really, if you're serious about fundraising, it's something that you need to seriously consider. The Charity Commission is very keen on charities registering. The Code of Fundraising Practice that it requires you to follow is pretty much good practice and will help you be successful in your funding. And I think perhaps you're not convinced by either of those reasons. I think increasingly it's acting as a kite mark in the sector, and we are increasingly seeing grant-making trusts, for example, before they provide funds to any charities, trying to establish whether they are registered with the fundraising regulator. So I would definitely encourage you to seriously look at that if you're not already registered. So I think that pretty much brings us to an end. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and particular thanks to Colin for sharing his insights. Some very interesting stuff there. Everyone who's registered for the webinar will receive an email, and the webinar is recorded and is available on our website. For those of you that enjoyed it so much, you'd like to listen to it again, but potentially perhaps for those of you who think it might be of interest to some of your colleagues. If you have any queries that you think of after the webinar, you'll see our contact details there, and either Colin or myself would be quite happy to pick those up. So just in conclusion, thank you very much for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.